update most of these forecasts on an annual basis. They go into a lot of the TFI reports. They're generally the sort of the fundamental trends that are causing change in the industry. Some of them we've been tracking for a long time. For those of you that follow our work, it probably gets boring because it's often just something you've seen before with another data point. And I know a lot of you want to strangle me with my S-shaped curves. You probably, a lot of you will by the end of this presentation, because you'll definitely see a lot of them. But they are pretty fundamental to my work and what's going on. And in fact, I'll take some time to, for those that aren't familiar with them, a little bit of time to explain what they're all about. So I'll go a little bit slow. For those that have seen it all, I kind of beg your patience while I do that. Most of you know that I'm a technology forecaster. It's a form of futurist, if you will. But we're especially interested in forecasting how technology changes, especially as it applies to industry and business decisions. It's a field that's been around for decades, actually. I got started in the late 1970s, and it was already a decade or two old back then. And of course, it's progressed over time, but it is definitely a field. And the things we do in technology forecasting are we forecast performance improvement, we forecast cost improvement in technology, we forecast how new technology is adopted over time, and how it replaces old technology. So when a new technology replaces an old, we call that substitution. And then we also forecast the impacts of those change. So if you think about it, performance improvement, cost improvement, old technology being replaced by new technology, affecting that old technology's life, and what that impacts, those are a lot of the things that we're concerned about in valuation and assessment, because those are things that involve life of equipment and the value of equipment. If you think about the value of anything is not really the past, the value of anything is its future. And so therefore, forecasting the future and being able to do these things that in this list are sort of key to determining value, really in its fundamental ways. So that's how, for some reason, some guy that, like me, that forecasts for decades now in the communications world has had a client mostly involved in value, because value intrinsically involves the future. Some of the methods we use is, there's some fundamental models of technology change that just, regardless of your industry, seem to be the patterns by which technology is adopted and how it improves. So we take advantage of those models, including the S-shaped models, a lot. Another thing we use a lot in forecasting is analogies. We try to find analogies of what's happened in the past to what's going to happen in the future. And I'll show you some examples of that. And then one thing we look at is drivers and constraints. What's driving the new technology forward and what's constraining it? And how do those balance? And what do we need to do to overcome the constraints? And then we do rely on expert opinion sometimes when forecasting the future. So that's sort of the basics of the toolbox. And what before I go into a little bit more about how those work, let me just convey to you some lessons that we've learned over time about technology. The one thing we learned, that nothing happens overnight. I've been tracking the adoption of fiber optics now for a couple decades. So fiber, which seems so important now, took a long time to make its way to the penetration that we've seen now. Same with things like cable modems, same with wireless and mobile. All these technologies did not happen overnight. I always chuckle a little bit when I think a couple of years ago when everybody in Austin was saying we'd all have self-driving cars by 2025. And I had to explain, no, that's not how technology works. Things don't happen overnight. There's the process that you have to go through, an adoption curve you have to go through. So that's one fundamental lesson. The other thing is that, though, that once these trends start, they are relentless. The need for wireless communications, the need for more bandwidth, better broadband, those are slow trends, but they are relentless. And betting against those fundamental changes are is futile and will end you up in bankruptcy court eventually. And so things don't happen overnight on one side, but on the other side, that's balanced by the fact that these slow-moving trains are often unstoppable, relentless, and have incredible impact. The other thing you find is that these fundamental trends, whatever they are, tend to destroy value in old technology. And since most of you are in valuation assessment, you're probably thinking of that in financial terms, but these forecasts are done for all sorts of business reasons. And what I'm really getting about is value, more in value of the firm itself and its operations. That companies that don't, and industries that don't keep up with technology tend to get buried and lose their value as well. So what I thought I'd do is take a few minutes to introduce substitution analysis, which is mostly S-shaped curves and something that we use a lot. And with substitution analysis, and this is one model, the Fisher-Price substitution model, what we're looking at is how a new technology is adopted in the market over time. So the horizontal axis is time. Usually that'll be in years. The vertical axis is the percentage penetration. And the label here says percentage of the installed base, but it's basically percentage of the market, not sales, but of users. So for example, it could be the percentage of automobiles that are electric, for example. It could be the percentage of the households that are passed by broadband, for example. It could be percentage of the population that has a cell phone. It could be the percentage of long-haul connections that are fiber optics. It could be just any technology, some measure of utility. And you'll notice that they normally, as time goes on, once it gets started, penetration is actually pretty slow at first. And this is reflecting the fact that most new technologies are either expensive, nobody knows how to use them or apply them, they often have bugs, they're often facing very formidable competition from the entrenched technology. There's often a lot of problems with the old technology, the new technology. But if it's a good new technology and superior, we get economies of scale, people become familiar with it, the needs and value of it become apparent to people, its superiority of the old technology happens, and it begins to pull itself up. And once it reaches about 10 or 15%, the tables get turned, and the new technology then has the advantages over the old technology, whether it's the advantages of a cell phone over the old landline phones, or it's a broadband over the old dial-up modems, or 5G versus 4G wireless. Once these advantages are apparent to everyone, we get on the steep part of the S-shaped curve, and penetration happens very quickly until we get to around 70 or 80%, when it begins to slow down a bit as the niche of the old technology sort of becomes dominant, and the new technology actually often slows down for a while. This could be maybe in broadband, highly rural areas that are harder to service, for example, just to give an example. So that's one model, the Fisher-Price. And here are some examples of different industries, everything from diesel locomotives replacing steam locomotives years ago to people adopting PCs in the office, and some examples in between. Notice they're all S-shaped curves. They're all following the Fisher-Price model, but they happen over different periods. So some of them take decades. Some, like local area networks, for example, were very, very quick. So if you go back one slide, the Fisher-Price model has two parameters, A, which sort of sets it in time, and B determines the rate of substitution. So the higher B is, the steeper this S-shaped curve, or the faster it happens. So the faster substitutions have a higher B value. And of course, some industries are faster than others. So another model we use a lot is called the Gompertz model. The Gompertz model is S-shaped also, but it's not symmetrical about the 50% point. Its inflection point is about 37%. That's the A value there. The conference model starts out pretty steep and then has a long tail. So the late adopters take a long time to adopt. And what we've generally found is the conference model is more applicable to consumer adoptions, where, what happens if you don't adopt 4K TV, for example? And nothing happens, right? I mean, if you don't adopt it, you don't adopt it. So there's not a business penalty for not getting with the program and adopting a new technology. So consumers can tend to take, particularly late adopters, can tend to take their time adopting new technology. So if we're looking at consumer adoptions, we're often looking at the conference model. But it's the same basic pattern. We're still looking at time, usually years, and the percentage of the installed base, often households or population, people that have adopted the new technology. So here's some examples of consumer adoptions that have followed the conference curve. So some of them were actually pretty slow, color TV, for example. Others, like broadband, have been pretty quick. Cell phones were quite quick. So if we have the same early data as illustrated here, generally the Fisher-Price will go faster, and then the conference will be a little bit slower. So it's important that we pick the right model when we're doing our forecasting. Now, how do we use this for forecasting? If we have some data, we can fit the curve using a least squares regression. Most statistical packages will do that. The problem is most of the decisions we need to make have to be made before we have a lot of data. So this is probably the most data we often have early in the game. So we're fitting with not a whole lot of data points. But we do, and it often gives pretty good forecasts, even with a small amount of data. And why does it give good forecasts? The reason it gives good forecasts is because we know that S-shaped curve model is what usually happens with new technologies. And we know there are reasons for why that happens, which I shared a couple with you. So that we're reasonably confident that once the trend starts, it's going to continue. Not that there aren't bumps and changes as we go, but that the basic pattern will be pretty close. And at least it'll be realistic, that we'll understand that things don't happen overnight. So what happens if we don't have any data points? Well, this is an example that really from our early years of forecasting broadband. This was done in early 1999. We had one data point for residential broadband then in terms of adoption, and that's a little blue dot way down at year in 1998. That's where we are, year in 1998. So we had, and that was like something under 1%. And we wanted to forecast broadband going forward. So we did a drivers and constraints analysis. We talked about it. We looked for analogies. And we kind of came to the conclusion that let's take the average of this set of analogies for the B value, plug that into the Fisher-Price model, the conference model, and came out with the blue line there. And we noticed that it also sort of parallels the red curve there, which was online households. Online households were households that had a dial-up modem, would dial up and access America Online, for example, the early internet type services. Or actually, that was even pre-internet. And so we had the conference curve already started for them, and we noticed that was parallel. So we had sort of like a precursor situation there. So we had reasonably good confidence that we had a good broadband forecast, and we used this using analogies and what I call drivers and constraints. So that's what we do when we don't have a lot of data. And just for curiosity, if you look here, we were forecasting by 2020, we'd be in the 80-90% penetration, that we'd reach 50% by what about? You can read it for me about 2010 or so. And you'll see some examples of what really happened. You'll notice that this is not too bad. And then sometimes we have to forecast before we've even started. And this is an example of an early HDTV forecasts that we made back in the mid-90s before we even had HDTV. And in this case, we had to first forecast when HDTV would be introduced and reach 1%. and then we had to forecast what it would be, how it would be adopted in the future. And so we did that and figured 2000 would be the starting point, and then used the Gompertz model with the color TV example as an analogy to forecast forward. Again, we did a drivers and constraints to determine whether that was reasonable. So a little bit of research has to go into these forecasts, but you can make forecasts using these S-shaped curves even before there's no data. Now, another key fundamental of this is the blue line here is our S-shaped curve. This one's the Fisher-Pry, and you can see the adoption pattern. But if you take 100% minus the percent new technology, you'll get the percentage old technology. And so that's what the red line is. It's just 100% minus whatever the blue line is. And that gives you basically the survivor curve, if you will, of the old technology. And so you can pick off any point in that line, the red line there, and determine what the pattern of survivors for the rest of the old technology, and come up with an average life, for example, and other factors. So this is kind of give you a hint at how we can use technology forecasting to start to get to depreciation lives and get to a little bit of value for the old technology. Now I have a whole hour presentation for how we get from here to say a percent good table. That's not the point of this conference. We're more aimed at the technology piece of it, but this is sort of the step one in getting there. Now, it's usually a little more complicated than this because often we have generations of technology. So, for example, in wireless, we started out with analog, and then we had, I forget what the first digital generation was called now, PCS. And then there was a 2G and 2.5 and 3G, and then there was 4G, and now there's 5G. And after the break, we're going to talk about 6G. So we'll have generations. Same thing with broadband, as we'll see in a second. So what we basically have are a series of S-shaped curves. Here I just have two, for example. So the first one is generation 1 and generations that come after it, substituting for generation 0. And so the blue line is the percentage of people that have adopted a new technology to start with generation 1 and then later generation 2. So that gives us the first generation adoption. And then the red line is generation 2, the second generation, replacing everything that came before it, generation 0. And so we have the blue line, the first substitution, the red line is the second one. If you subtract the red line from the blue line, in other words, the first substitution from the second substitution at any point in time, you'll get the bell-shaped curve there. The bell-shaped curve is the life cycle for the first generation. So it goes up sort of according to the blue S-shaped curve, and then it sort of goes down caused by the red substitution, the newest substitution coming, that's basically substituting for the first generation. So you can work out the math. It's a pretty simple matter of subtraction. But if we do these two substitutions, then we can get the life cycle of a technology. And if we have multiple S-shaped curves, then we'll have a bunch of these different bell-shaped curves. And we first use this technique in anger, if you will, in forecasting broadband. Again, back in the 90s. If you looked at analog modems, a few of you may remember analog modems. I remember them very well. They started out like at 300 bits per second, or baud, and then they came up to 1.2, and then every year or so, they increased in speed. And they finally peaked at 56 kilobits a second, which was really about the fastest you could do over the phone network. So it was reaching a limit. So this is an example of a typical progression of technology. It's the same basic principle as Moore's law, that you'll notice the semi-log scale where it goes 1, 10, 100. That's typical of an exponential curve and typical of technology progression. So when we're seeing that with analog modems, we realized that with broadband, we'd be jumping onto another curve, starting with 1,500 bits per second, which is 1.5 megabits per second. So about a megabit per second is where we started out with broadband. And then we then had generations after that going to 6 and 24 megabits per second, and then finally 100 megabits per second. And by using these curves, we could predict when the various generations would start. So we were predicting, back in the mid-90s that by the 2010 or so, people would start wanting 100 megabits per second. So that generation would come. So by using this information, we were able to come up with starting points for the S-shaped curves, and then therefore we could calculate the life cycles of the various generations. And these little labels down at the bottom give you some idea of why we thought these curves were important. Back then, in the mid-90s, we were mostly doing our forecasting work for the old telephone companies that were just looking at broadband. And at that time, almost all the telephone service was via copper pairs. There's a little bit of fiber optics in their trunk and feeder routes, but it was mostly copper pairs. And everybody was using dial-up modems on those old telephone lines to access the internet. And it was obvious that that was not going to be sufficient. We needed broadband. And so the telephone companies needed technologies for getting there. And we knew that fiber optics was the ultimate one, but we also knew that it would take a long time to get there, that we'd have to do a DSL, a digital subscriber line, that would give us 1.5 megabits per second. And then if we could bring the fiber closer to the home, we could get maybe to 6, and then maybe 24. And if we got within 1,000 feet from the home with fiber, then we could go maybe 100 megabits per second at most. So in thinking about how the telephone network would have to evolve technologically and therefore determine the life of copper cable, we had to have forecasts like these that would give us the timing of when all these things would happen. And it was very important that by 2020, we needed to be all 100 megabit per second, because that gave us a target for when the phone companies would need to be 100% fiber, at least to the last 1,000 feet, regardless of what technology they use. Now what happened was, I know this is ancient history, but it's still to this day, still relevant. And that is, the cable companies had essentially broadband already through their coaxial networks that were delivering TV, which is in itself high bandwidth. I mean, every old-fashioned TV channel was 6 megahertz, which is basically, even for bit would be like 6 megabits per second, which is pretty fast. So they the cable companies had an advantage. They came out with cable modems, and basically were able to get up these curves pretty quickly themselves. But they've also had to put in fiber closer and closer to the home to get to these higher bandwidths for each subscriber. So a lot of the story of broadband is the cable companies, doing cable modems, and the telephone companies bringing fiber closer and closer and moving from DSL to others. So that's kind of the tutorial for how we use technology forecasting, particularly substitution analysis, in making forecasts. So what I'd like to do now is turn to where we are now and our current forecast going forward. I'll spend most of my time on broadband. Okay, here's the same curve you saw before, that was from the mid-90s, circa now. We've gone way beyond 100 megabits per second. 300 megabits per second is typical now. Some of us are lucky enough to have gig service. And then in the 2020s, we're going to see a 3 gigabit per second generation. We're getting there already. And then we're expecting before the end of this decade to start the 10 gig generation. Okay, so basically we're still on track. The growth rate is a little bit slower than we thought back 20 years ago, but 30 years ago, sorry. But it's still tracking. Just a little bit slower than Moore's Law now. Pretty impressive. These are those multiple S-shaped curves that I mentioned of each generation replacing the others. And this is the forecast from 2022, what I showed you last year. This is what we used last year. I'll show you the update in a minute, but it's interesting to look here. Oh, most of the historical data here, the little squares, are from FCC Form 477 reports that the carriers have to give every 6 months. The trouble with the FCC things is they usually lag a couple years behind, and especially recently, they've lagged way behind, at least in terms of what they publish. The data's there if you can get to it sooner, but we've lagged behind. And so I've started supplementing it with some other data from Open Vault that's on a quarterly basis and almost report it instantaneously. So the red circles are the new data source, and they're pretty darn compatible with each other. So this gave us some more data to look at. And what this showed was a percentage of households, these are subscribers, that by 2022, we were, the little pink line there with the circles, we were at almost 70%, 100 megabits per second and above. So not really the 90% we were hoping for back in the 90s, but still pretty good. The 300 megabits per second and above had gotten to about 35% on a pretty fast track. And 1 gig had also gotten to about 10% on a pretty fast track. Broadband overall, because we're using the FCC data for broadband households, in other words, the total percentage, we didn't have the last couple data points. So the last data point we had was year-end 2019. And we were still very much on the S-shaped curve, kind of slowly going up. Then this week last week I pulled up the data for the most recent data for all of this. Oh, excuse me. Here, these are the life cycle curves that go along with the S-shaped curves that I showed you with that process of subtraction. Notice how nice and smooth they still are? Okay, this is what happened when I added the new data. The little blue circles is 300 megabits per second. The dashed line is the prior trend. Look, the last few data points have been way above the prior trend. We've jumped from 100 megabits per second to 300 megabits per second. Super fast. A lot of this, I think, is because the cable companies were very nice to us as consumers, and they bumped a lot of us from 100 to 300 megabits per second without charging us anything extra for it. So they did it automatically. Partially to compete with the telephone companies that started introducing 1 gigabit service, and also to really kind of step on DSL, which was even close to that. And then part of that is just simply all that gigabit service is counted in the 300 megabits and above. So that's part of it. So those two processes alone pulled it up. So that was interesting. The other interesting thing that happened was that I got the broadband data points for year in 2000 and year in 2021. And for the first time in a long time, broadband popped up over the smooth curve we've been seeing for years. So whatever the reason, and we'll talk about a couple of the reasons, broadband adoption itself went up quite a bit. Part of it, I'm sure, is due to COVID and the pandemic and people going online and spending more time online. Part of it may be availability. But for the first time in a long time, we've seen a really big bump in broadband. This gives you some visibility into this. This is FCC data through year in 2021, which is about as good as we get. And then every row is a technology. So the first row is cable. And so from 2018 to 2021, we added 8 million cable modem subscribers. Fiber to the premises, and this is by the telephone companies, by independent providers, and by cable companies that also offer fiber to the premise. We added 10 million. So that's 18 million from those two alone. And then we lost 5 million from people dropping off DSL. We gained 1 million with fixed wireless, though. So that's a pretty big piece in itself. And some of those are probably first-time adopters to broadband. Couldn't get anything before, now they can get fixed wireless. And then satellite was about the same. So on net, we gained about 14 million broadband subscribers in those 4 years between 18 and 21, excuse me, 1, 2, 3 years. This is also interesting. It shows the download speed by technology. So looking at 100 megabits per second, cable went from 76% of its subscribers had the maximum they get was 100 megabits per second. It went from 76 to 85% in 2021. It's still under 10% for DSL. So DSL, as we knew all along, was never going to get you much above even 200 megabits per second, much less above it. So it's 0% for a gig service. Fiber to the premises is now 85%, at least 100 megabits per second. And 40% a gigabit. 940 megabits per second is almost a gigabit. And then satellite has gone from a low-speed service to at least 7% being high speed. But look at fixed wireless. It went from 18% availability of at least 25 megabits to 58, and even 100 megabits per second has gone into 9%. And I think with I don't usually mention names in this presentation, but with T-Mobile's, their fixed wireless, you'll probably see that go up by the latest data point, probably well over that. And even fixed wireless has a gigabit presence going up from 2%. So there's been a lot of progress recently in the cable and in the fiber and in fixed wireless as well. We'll talk about all those more as we go, of course. This is the same chart for 2003, but this time I've added it to gigabit as well, so that we can see the recent data points for gigabit service is also a little bit faster than expected. The red line shows what would happen if we just use those data points to forecast. That we get to, by 2030, we'd be at about almost 80% gigabit service in terms of percentage of households. But this raises the question: if we went so fast with 300 megabits per second, what stops us from making the gigabit per second go faster? For the cable companies, it's almost a turn of a dial. It's not quite that easy, but I mean, they have to do a lot of things, but and they might have more fiber. But for at least some customers, I mean, it wouldn't be hard for them to do it. We're building fiber really quick. For the same reason that we went up to 300 scale, we might go up to 1 gigabit scale really quickly. You can think of a pattern where more and more fiber premises put in, offering gigabit service, that pulls it up, and then in response, the cable modem providers decide that they need to up their service from 300 to a gig or better, and so we get into another war. So the dashed line is my version of what might happen if things go faster than expected in terms of gig. So I'm not ready yet to tell you which it's going to be, but our baseline forecast is a red one, but I'm suspecting that when we come back here next year, we may be closer to that dashed line. Too early to tell. Excuse me. Maybe later this year, I'm going to put up to 3 gigabit, which would be the next thing. It'll be advertised as 2 to 3. We may jump to 10 gigabit, but just like we went from, but we'll probably go like we went from 300 to 1. We'll probably go from 3 gig to 10. Not ready to put those generations up, but you can kind of imagine from what you've heard so far what those are going to look like, right? They're going to probably be a lot like that red line, just shifted in time. Now, remember, we can take these F-shaped curves and translate those into the bell-shaped curves. They don't look so pretty anymore because the blue line is 300. It goes up really quick, and then it has a kind of a more slower decline as 1 gig replaces it. And then, of course, the peak life cycle for 100 megabits per second is going down really quickly. So the graphics won't be as pleasant as they used to be because of this rapid adoption of 300 megabits per second, but that's reality. And if we use the dashed line forecast for 1 gig, the the 300 megabits per second life cycle will be also have a steep decline as well as a steep increase. Okay, so that's sort of the subscriber side of things. Let's now talk about a little bit about the supply side of things. Basically, you can't, as consumers, we can't subscribe to something unless at least one provider is offering it. And we call that availability. And then it's the same as deployment, which is what the FCC uses. So this gives an idea of what deployment is of the various technologies. So for example, cable is 84% of households now are passed by cable, according to this statistic. 78% of them have DOCSIS 3.1 now. Copper is 88% with broadband. Fiber, 48%, which is a huge number now. Satellite, of course, 100%. And terrestrial fixed wireless has gotten up to 85%. So that's the deployment, availability, if you will. And these are the number of residential connections for each of these, and this gives you the residential take rate. So cable has a really sweet take rate of 64%. Fiber has got about 39% take rate, which is not bad, and probably would be higher if they hadn't been late to the game. Copper is down to 13%. That used to be 100% in one day. And then terrestrial fixed wireless is about 2.4% in terms of take rate. Satellite services, 1% available 100%, but 1% of the population have it for, I guess, obvious reasons. This is sort of the similar data, just plotted over time. You can see the deployment rate of the DOCSIS 3.1 cable, which really makes 10G, 10 gig service, 1 gig service, both of those practical. 3.0 is pretty capable too, but 3.1 gives a lot more flexibility and efficiency for offering gig service. Fiber has gone from 20% in 2015 to over 40%, almost 50% in those few years. And then fixed wireless has gone from 30% to 85% or so. I'll kind of keep these in mind because you're going to see them again real soon. So going back to our forecast for the S-shaped curves, again, these were substitutions of subscribers, but what we really want, of course, is deployment. Because if we're measuring lives of equipment, it's the deployment that matters. And what we found, and this goes back decades, a pattern between what the required deployment needs to be to meet a certain demand forecast. So this is 100 megabits per second, and the curve, the subscriber curve for that. We can mathematically calculate then from that Gompertz curve, a Fisher-Price curve, which is the blue curve there, that shows what the required availability is from an industry perspective. And the way to think about this is if your homes pass is on or above that blue line, you're going to get your fair share of the market, and you're going to do okay. If it's below that, you're not going to get your fair share of the market, and the people that are above that line, the providers that are above that line, are going to get that business. So it's kind of like a target for deployment, and it's the one we use in our forecasts for forecasting what suppliers are going to provide. And we say, look at where they are now and where they need to be competitive, and we'll use that to draw a forecast. And we use that over what their plans are for at least especially more than 1 or 2 years out. And if they don't match that, then maybe our forecast is wrong, but it probably means that they're going to lose customers if they don't. So that blue line and that relationship, the pink line, is really important to us. So let's look at where we've actually been. So for 100 megabits per second above, the cable connections are shown up there. They're mostly above the blue line. So at least for the first 85% of the market, 90% of the market, they're right there. On the other hand, fiber, which is needed to provide 100 megabits per second service because DSL won't cut it, that industry, basically the telephone companies, we're only at 25% below the black line and then stay below it. So this is why DSL fell so quickly, why the cable companies have, cable has 65% of the subscription rates is because of this. Now let's look at 300 megabits per second above, and we're going to ignore the new forecast and just look at last year's forecast using the older data. So 300 megabits per second required availability is the blue line, and that's where we are. So for that generation, cable's still doing great. Fiber's above it for most of the time until we get to about 40% of the market, and then there's still not enough fiber available to compete with cable for 300 megabits per second and above. And I think that's why we've seen things in the market happen in the last couple of years. Now, what might fiber do? Well, this is a forecast for what we probably should see fiber do to catch up. And I'll show you a little bit more where that comes from in a minute. What about a gigabit per second service? There's our line for gigabit. If you wanted to compete just in gigabit, then DOCSIS 3.1 is I've changed the cable to that because they really kind of need that. And they're in good shape there. Fiber so far is in good shape for that generation as well. And that's why, of course, it's advertised as 1 gig service. And where might it go in the future? Well, if it wants to be competitive in the next generation for 1 gig, then fiber needs to do something like that. Ideally, so it's going to stay above the line, ideally be quite a bit above it. It could stay slow and then meet the blue line, but if it did that, it wouldn't be competitive with the 300 megabits per second service. And, I'm going backwards now, guys. So it really needs to do that. So that's kind of what we're thinking about fiber. So by 2025, we're going to see maybe 80% of households instead of the current almost 50% be covered. And this is showing the same forecast, but with the fast version of the broadband adoption, or 1 gig adoption, with the dashed line showing what might happen. So again, I think adding credence to the forecast. And then I mentioned fixed wireless as being suddenly a player. The green line is the percentage of all households that have fixed wireless available to them. And then it shows the required availability curve for 100 megabits, 300, and 1 gig. And you can see that fixed wireless was kind of too late for the 100 megabits per second generation, but pretty much in time for 300 megabits and 1 gig. The only problem is right now, only 9%, or at least as of year in 2021, only 9% was even at 100 megabits per second and above. I think it's way over that now. And only 2% of them were 1 gig, which is the next target. But there's potential there for fixed wireless to get there, and maybe we'll talk more about that. But I would see that the fixed wireless being a much bigger player in this if they get their speeds up to match these targets. So the broadband summary is that we'll continue to expect speeds to increase. Now 1G is the optimal speed. 10G is what's in the future. The broadband will continue to, demand will continue to require the deployment of more fiber, upgrading of equipment, replacing equipment as on a constant basis like we've been doing for the last 3 decades in broadband. It'll just continue. We're starting to see competition for wireless, including fixed wireless. And I say this every year, the telco copper is doomed. I mean, some of it's still there, and some will still be there for a while, but it's doomed. It had a great run for decades and decades, but game over. How long will these broadband speeds increase? Basic technology forecasting principle is as long as the performance will increase as long as it's feasible and as long as it's useful. The rate may change if technology approach changes, but the technology approach is pretty well known now. It's feasible. I believe it's useful, as we'll talk more about tomorrow. So the 10 gigabits generation to me is a sure thing. Beyond that, who knows? But for right now, we're looking at definitely, this will go on until at least the 10G for broadband. Wireless, who knows? Okay, another thing we forecast a lot is online video. those of you that have been here for at least 10 years or so have been seeing us show this forecast in various forms, starting with zero data. But it basically shows the share of TV viewing minutes on streaming versus traditional TV. And we see a classical S-shaped curve here. We're up to 30% as of, I think that's a year in 2021, I guess. And thought I had 2022. Anyway, crossing point is 50% is just in a couple of years. Right now, the traditional multi-channel TV is still predominant in terms of viewing hours, still useful, but a lot of people are streaming. The streaming, unless traditional TV stops being offered for some reason, which I don't expect it will, but unless it does, then we'll probably see a curve like this. Key thing here is that streaming TV is broadband service. The traditional TV is kind of multi-channel broadcast, regardless of the media. And so we got to make, the cable companies especially, but everybody providing a multiple channel service is going to have to maintain both of these for a long time over the same network generally. So it'll be a challenging situation to perform in both. Oh, I know what it was. That was a 2002 forecast. This is a 2003 forecast with the 2002 data point. And as you can see, there's not much change as we add the 2002 data point. Now we're at 40%. Sorry. Another thing that that we track is the generations of television. So we've gone from HD TV, which essentially all households now have at least an HD TV, to the 4K generation, where we've now gone over 50%, and now we've started the 8K generation, which is still less than 1% of households. This was a 2002 forecast. This is 2023, the latest one. The data here is actually pretty hard to find without paying a whole lot, but I can estimate it pretty closely just based on shipments and some assumptions. So the little red squares are 21 and 22 year end, estimated, but pretty accurate. So now roughly 70% of households will have a 4K TV. And actually for the bigger sizes, you really can't buy, if you want to buy a new TV and it's going to be over 50 inches or 50 inches above, it's going to be 4K. It just comes that way. You might not care, you could perhaps care less whether it's 4K or not. It doesn't matter, it's going to be 4K. Why is this important? Well, with all that streaming, the streaming data rates have changed by the speed. And it's not just watching TV, it's all the other things we do on monitors. And then of course with the 8K is actually roughly 4 times as many pixels. And so therefore as people adopt 8K, again, whether they like it or not, will be then having that much more bandwidth. So basically for 4K, we're going up to about 18 megabits per second. I've seen like Netflix is actually 25 megabits per second now, ideally what you'd have. So as we go up these speeds, we're talking about more and more megabits per second. So as we get to HK, not immediately, but somewhere by 2030, we're going to be having a lot of 8Ks out there. They're probably going to want to stream 8K, and that means we're talking about 60 megabits per channel. No big deal, because most of us will be a gigabit, and having 3 or 4 60 megabit percent channels going from your house at 1 gig is not a big deal. But it's a driver for continued bandwidth, because you don't want to be running 8K with 300 megabits per second, given all the other things going on at your house. So the implications for cable companies of the broadband and what I just said is you're going to see continued losses in multi-channel TV for subscription, but they're going to be around for a long time, so you need to serve both at the same time. We're going to see competition from wireless. The telcos have stepped up their game in bringing out fiber. And because of that, it'll be a more challenging environment for cable than it's been in the past. It won't be the cakewalk over DSL that it had been for a long time because of the fiber. As great as HFC is, it is less energy efficient. So there are some competitive reasons for adopting more fiber. A lot of the cable companies are doing that, although the HFC will be around for a long time. And a lot of this is going to require, from all the companies, both wireless, wireline, cable, traditional telco, all of them are going to have to put more investment in a competitive environment, which means investment without a lot of increase in revenue to match it often. The wireless forecast, I'll go over briefly. We're going to hear a lot about wireless soon. Total subscribers keeps going up. We've passed half a billion, 500 million subscribers. There's only 300-something people in the state, so we're well over one connection per person. And in fact, everybody doesn't have a cell phone, believe it or not. So our standard connections have probably peaked, which is shown by the little blue squares there. So it's been machine to machine, or various true machines or pads and so forth that are beginning to be the growth in the market now, the so-called M2M. And we're seeing that following a standard adoption curve. Who knows what the limit is, but we would see continued growth in connections, mostly M2M. Let's skip that one. And this is our generation forecast, where we've seen the 5G now become available and to be adopted. So the forecast has now become, beginning to be a actual trend, adoption curve. And we'd say by 2030, it'd be all 5G, and the 4G life cycle will be over. Coming attraction, the 6G and above. We'll hear a lot about that after the break. And maybe this year we'll post a 6G forecast based on what we learn soon. Gary Wiggins is not here, but every time we put up this curve, Gary Wiggins points out that the life cycle for 4G is not from 2010 to 2030 or 20 years, but it's actually the red line there from when the average one piece of equipment is purchased till it goes out, which is more like 9 years. And there's technology substitution that goes on beyond just the generations. I don't know if Gary's on it somewhere, but you're welcome, Gary. So the implication for wireless providers is pretty much there's never any appetite for bandwidth and performance, in other words, latency, that type of thing. There's more focus on M2M now. We're seeing greatly improve the cost and performance. We've seen that in the past. We're continuing to see it. Spectral efficiency, for example, keeps going up. And that requires continuous investment in new technology and spectrum. So the overall industry assessment is, this is a great industry. Not only do we do really important things, but we're also really staying on top of the technology and staying competitive. But we see continued increase in demand for bandwidth. We have continued delivery of those increases by the industry. Continued investment to make it happen. You're doing all this in a highly competitive advantage, and it's still crucial to all the new things that are happening, whether it's automation in vehicles, whether it's meetings and telepresence and those types of things, telecommuting. All those things involve what we do. So it's an exciting time still to be around.